The mahogany conference table in the 42nd floor boardroom reflected the morning sunlight. I measured the glare at exactly 30 degrees. My stepbrother Julian stood at the head of the table. He was actively mocking my inexpensive suit jacket. He pointed his platinum pen at my chest. He told the board members I was nothing but a low-level auditor. He claimed I had no authority to review their quarterly financials. Julian was currently serving as the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Logistics. He secured this position exactly 10 years ago. That was the same year my father died. My stepmother Elaine forged the estate documents to completely disinherit me. I was left with $14.12 in my account at age 18. Now, I am 28 years old. I live and work in the financial district of Manhattan. I am the lead restructuring architect for Apex Capital Holdings. Before we proceed with evaluation, where are you listening to this right now? What time is it right now in your time zone? Tell me in the comments below. My job involves dismantling failing corporate entities. I execute aggressive leveraged buyouts of distressed assets. I do not feel anger when entitled executives throw tantrums. I analyze their stress responses like a behavioral economist. Julian slammed his quarterly earnings folder onto the polished wood. He demanded that I leave his building immediately. He threatened to call security if I touched his physical documents. Elaine sat to his right with a smug expression. She wore a diamond necklace that cost $85,000. It was purchased directly from the proceeds of my father's stolen life insurance policy. She told me to go back to the mailroom. They assumed I was a lowly junior associate sent to simply collect their basic tax forms. They were completely unaware of my actual corporate mandate. I remained perfectly still under the fluorescent lighting. I did not blink or show any sign of intimidation. I calmly opened my black leather briefcase. I extracted the finalized transfer of equity agreement from a sealed compartment. It was printed on heavy stock paper. Apex Capital Holdings had quietly purchased 68% of Vanguard Logistics' outstanding debt. We converted that bad debt into majority voting shares at exactly 9 this morning. I was not there to audit their failing company. I was there to legally terminate their entire board. The mechanics of their theft were surprisingly simple. My father built Vanguard Logistics from a single delivery truck. He expanded it into a regional powerhouse. The gross annual revenue was exactly $42 million. He suffered a massive ischemic stroke during my senior year of high school. Elaine was his legal power of attorney. She immediately initiated a hostile restructuring of his personal assets. She hired a highly corrupt probate attorney to explicitly draft a questionable postnuptial amendment. The document transferred 95% of the voting shares directly to her holding company. She claimed the business was severely over-leveraged and nearing bankruptcy. She told me I was entirely incapable of managing corporate debt. Julian was appointed as the acting director of operations. He was 24 years old at the time. He possessed absolutely zero logistical management experience. They legally and aggressively evicted me from my childhood home precisely 2 weeks after the funeral. They changed the electronic security codes while I was at the public library. Elaine left a voicemail claiming she was protecting me from aggressive creditors. She said the house was being seized by the regional bank. I later discovered she sold the property for $2,400,000. She deposited the entire sum into an offshore tax shelter. I lived in my deteriorating sedan for exactly 8 months. I worked night shifts as a data entry clerk. I processed raw commercial shipping manifests for a rival logistics firm. I taught myself advanced predictive financial modeling during my breaks. I analyzed the regional supply chain inefficiencies. I watched Julian slowly destroy my father's legacy through pure arrogance. He authorized the purchase of a luxury corporate jet. The leasing terms cost the company $84,000 every single month. Elaine funneled corporate profits into her personal philanthropic foundation. They drained the operational liquidity while gaslighting the board of directors. They manipulated the quarterly profit and loss statements. They capitalized basic operational expenses to artificially inflate their asset margins. They believed their accounting fraud was entirely undetectable. They assumed the penniless teenager they discarded would simply fade into absolute poverty. They never expected me to spend a decade mastering the complex mechanics of corporate liquidation. I studied their financial filings with forensic precision. I built a comprehensive operational profile of their systemic incompetence. I was patiently preparing to systematically dismantle their entire stolen empire. Julian operated under the delusion that his corporate debts were entirely private. He clearly did not understand the mechanics of secondary debt markets. Vanguard Logistics relied on an outdated enterprise resource planning system. It was a legacy software framework that left visible digital footprints across public ledgers. I built a proprietary data scraping algorithm during my second year at Apex Capital. I programmed it to automatically aggregate National Uniform Commercial Code financing statements in real time. My algorithm tracked every single financial misstep Julian made over the last decade. He secured a highly toxic mezzanine loan 3 years ago. The principal amount was exactly $14,250,000. The interest rate was a predatory 14.5%. Julian used this capital to artificially inflate his gross earnings before interest and taxes. He foolishly pledged the entire core logistics vehicle fleet as the primary physical collateral for the transaction. He assumed the original lending institution simply held the debt on their books. The reality of corporate finance is much more ruthless. The regional commercial bank immediately packaged his toxic corporate loan into a massive collateralized debt obligation. They rapidly sold it to a specialized distressed asset fund. I used my executive authority at Apex Capital to quietly establish a special purpose vehicle. It was an anonymous Delaware limited liability company designed solely to acquire Vanguard Logistics debt. My stepmother believed her wealth was insulated by aggressive legal walls. She had completely failed to realize that senior secured debt completely supersedes equity ownership in a liquidation event. I purchased their active mezzanine loan on the secondary market for 32 cents on the dollar. The total acquisition cost was precisely $4,560,000. I authorized the transfer using our internal master clearing accounts. I had essentially bought their entire logistics operation for a fraction of its actual market value. They never once checked the ownership registry of their primary debt servicer. Julian casually authorized the monthly interest payments of $172,180. He unknowingly wired those funds directly into my corporate treasury accounts every single month. I used their own massive interest payments to finance my aggressive acquisition strategy. They were funding their own hostile takeover. I held the absolute power to accelerate the loan maturity. I was the silent and calculating architect of their impending corporate default. I remained perfectly still in the boardroom as Julian stared at the printed equity agreement. He laughed loudly and called it a pathetic forgery. He claimed Apex Capital Holdings would never invest in a stable corporate entity like Vanguard Logistics. He was profoundly wrong on both counts. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a secondary secure tablet. I opened the master administrative portal for his specific mezzanine loan. The debt contract contained a very specific financial covenant regarding liquid asset reserves. It required Vanguard Logistics to maintain a strict debt service coverage ratio of 1.5. My algorithm had officially flagged their ratio at 0.8 exactly 4 days ago. This constituted an immediate and incurable default event under standard corporate banking regulations. I tapped the screen and initiated the formal loan acceleration clause. The entire principal balance of $14,250,000 was now instantly due. Julian scoffed and reached for his platinum desk phone to call his senior corporate banker. I watched him dial the familiar local branch number. He aggressively demanded to speak with the senior portfolio manager immediately. The automated system politely informed him that the account was permanently closed. I had already executed a full administrative freeze on their primary operational bank accounts. The master clearinghouse processed my legal claim at precisely 8 this morning. Every single dollar of corporate liquidity was legally seized to satisfy the newly accelerated debt. Elaine suddenly stopped smiling. She opened her personal laptop and tried to access the central corporate payroll server. She gasped loudly when a red critical error message suddenly appeared on her display screen. I had revoked their master administrative permits using my newly confirmed executive authority. The National Logistics Fleet tracking software was instantly locked down behind an encrypted corporate firewall. The corporate fleet fuel cards were immediately suspended across the entire North American vendor network. I severed their financial lifelines with 3 deliberate and highly calculated taps on my tablet. Julian slammed the phone down and began screaming about illegal corporate espionage. He threatened to call the police and have me arrested for federal cyber terrorism. I calmly informed him that my actions were entirely lawful and structurally absolute. As the new majority shareholder, I possessed the unilateral legal right to protect the corporate assets. I handed him the formally printed notice of immediate executive employment termination. It clearly stated he was no longer an authorized representative of Vanguard Logistics. His face turned completely pale as the mathematical reality finally registered in his mind. He had spent a decade stealing from a highly vulnerable and completely defenseless teenager. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with an apex financial corporate predator. I methodically packed my secure tablet back into my heavy black leather briefcase. The quiet severance was completely executed. Their entire corporate infrastructure was now fully under my absolute and permanent control. They were effectively locked out of their own stolen castle without warning. The boardroom was completely silent for exactly 45 agonizing seconds. Julian stared blankly at the printed notice of immediate executive termination. He suddenly crumpled the heavy stock paper into a very tight ball. He threw it aggressively across the massive polished mahogany boardroom table. He shouted loudly that I was a completely delusional corporate thief. He claimed his high-priced defense attorneys would bury me in endless civil litigation. He threatened to file an emergency injunction in the Delaware Court of Chancery before noon today. I knew his primary corporate defense counsel charged $950 an hour. His legal team required a strict minimum retainer of $150,000 to initiate a chancery lawsuit. Julian currently possessed exactly $0 total dollars in liquid corporate capital. Elaine realized the aggressive legal threats were mathematically impossible to execute. She quickly shifted her tactical approach to emotional manipulation. She stood up from her leather chair and walked slowly toward my side of the table. She manufactured a look of deep maternal concern. She spoke in a softly trembling voice designed to elicit profound guilt. She reminded me that my father loved this company more than anything else in the world. She claimed she only took control of the logistics firm to protect his fragile legacy from aggressive corporate raiders. She told me we needed to put aside our petty differences and act like a real family. She gently placed her hand on the sleeve of my inexpensive suit jacket. I looked down at her manicured fingers resting on my arm. She wore a platinum ring set with a 3-carat emerald. I stepped backward to sever the physical contact. I did not engage with her fabricated emotional narrative. I calmly informed them both of their immediate personal liabilities. I stated that as the new majority shareholder I was legally obligated to conduct a forensic audit. I explicitly detailed the specific corporate tax fraud parameters they had recklessly triggered. Julian panicked and demanded to know what specific fraud I was alleging. I explained that capitalizing basic operational expenses artificially inflated the company valuation by 22%. I informed him that this specific maneuver constituted federal wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code. The maximum statutory penalty was exactly 20 years in federal prison per documented offense. I possessed physical documentation proving exactly 74 individual instances of this specific felony. Elaine began to breathe rapidly as her carefully constructed reality dissolved completely. She quickly realized her heavily guarded offshore tax shelters could not legally protect her from federal criminal indictments. Julian reached for his mobile phone with visibly shaking hands. He desperately tried to call the regional logistics managers to manually intercept the physical truck fleet. I watched him slowly realize the secure mobile application was now completely dead. They were entirely stripped of their systemic power and helplessly trapped in their own glass tower. I methodically prepared to deliver the final crushing administrative blow. I opened my encrypted laptop right there on the mahogany table. I booted the proprietary data extraction tool I built at Apex Capital. Julian demanded to know what I was doing on the corporate server. He clearly did not understand that I was bypassing the server entirely. I was accessing the raw automated clearinghouse batch files directly from the Federal Reserve portal. I executed a highly specific SQL query to isolate Elaine's offshore transactions. The system instantly matched the corporate disbursement logs to a registered shell company in the Cayman Islands. The shell entity was named Horizon Ventures LLC. Elaine used it to siphon exactly $2,400,000 from the original estate sale. She also diverted $112,600 in corporate fuel subsidies to this exact account. I displayed the extracted digital ledger on the massive boardroom presentation monitor. I pointed to the specific network protocol timestamps. The cryptographic signatures proved she authorized the fraudulent transfers from the secure router inside her primary residence. The digital footprint was completely unalterable and mathematically absolute. Julian was not immune to my forensic data extraction. I ran a secondary Python script to audit the logistics fleet depreciation schedule. I cross-referenced the vehicle identification numbers with the National Way Station logs. He had secretly sold exactly 12 heavy-duty freight liners to a shadow buyer in Mexico. He reported the physical assets as a total catastrophic loss to the corporate insurance provider. He collected a fraudulent payout totaling $1,850,000. He then kept the vehicles actively running on unregulated southern shipping routes. I compiled these specific data points into a finalized master compliance dossier. I exported the raw server logs into a clean comma-separated values file. I generated a highly detailed pivot table demonstrating their exact chronological pattern of financial abuse. I attached the original cryptographic certificates to prove the extracted data was completely unadulterated. The total sum of misappropriated corporate capital equaled precisely $4,362,600. This staggering amount triggered an automatic mandatory reporting threshold under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I did not need to physically gather paper receipts. I simply weaponized their own digital infrastructure against them. I burned the entire compiled dossier onto a single encrypted physical flash drive. I pulled a pre-printed shipping label from my black leather briefcase. The clearly intended recipient was the Criminal Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The heavy manila envelope sat perfectly centered on the massive boardroom table. Julian stared at the physical package with wide, terrified eyes. They had walked blindly into my administrative trap exactly 10 years ago. The heavy steel jaws were now officially and permanently locked into place. I checked my watch and noted the exact time of their absolute defeat. It was precisely 10:49 in the morning on a Tuesday. The quiet room felt utterly perfect as I waited for them to speak. Elaine was the first to break the heavy silence in the boardroom. She realized the digital evidence of her Cayman Islands shell corporation was absolutely undeniable. She smoothly changed her posture to project an aura of pragmatic business negotiation. She calmly suggested we did not need to involve federal regulatory agencies in a private family matter. She offered to immediately transfer 45% of her voting shares directly into my personal holding company. She claimed this generous concession would instantly make me a senior managing partner at Vanguard Logistics. Julian stepped away from the massive mahogany table and walked toward the heavy glass doors. He strategically placed his body directly in front of the primary exit. He was clearly attempting to utilize basic physical intimidation to restrict my movement. He crossed his arms and told me we were going to sit here until we reached a binding legal agreement. He stated he would personally authorize a discrete corporate dividend payment of exactly $2,500,000. He explicitly framed this massive corporate bribe as a retroactive consulting fee to avoid triggering mandatory Internal Revenue Service audits. They were essentially offering me a minority equity stake in a logistics company I already completely owned outright. They were actively attempting to buy my silence using my own legally accelerated corporate capital. I looked at the massive digital presentation monitor still displaying their extensive federal criminal liabilities. I calmly explained that a retroactive consulting fee of that magnitude requires a unanimous executive board resolution. I quietly reminded them that I had legally dissolved the entire board of directors exactly 42 minutes ago. I pointed out that under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act, accepting their bribe constitutes criminal complicity. Elaine slammed her manicured hands flat onto the polished wood surface as her pragmatic business facade instantly evaporated. She aggressively told me that destroying this company would render my newly inherited majority shares completely worthless. She argued that a federal criminal indictment would instantly trigger a massive uncontainable corporate market panic. She insisted the regional supply chain vendors would immediately sever all active transport contracts upon hearing the breaking news. She was desperately attempting to weaponize mutual financial destruction to force my complete administrative compliance. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge Julian physically blocking the primary glass exit doors. I simply tapped the secure screen of my encrypted tablet to reveal a secondary financial projection matrix I built last night. I had already formally negotiated a highly lucrative asset purchase agreement with a massive national freight conglomerate. They signed a contract to acquire the Vanguard Logistics vehicle fleet for exactly $38,420,000. The physical company was mathematically worth significantly more as disassembled liquidated assets than as a functioning corporate entity. Their desperate false truce was based entirely on a fundamentally flawed and completely outdated valuation model. I was only here to systematically carve out its highly profitable internal corporate organs. Julian's blockade of the glass doors was immediately interrupted by the scheduled arrival of the regional management team. The quarterly operations briefing was officially slated for exactly 11 in the morning. 12 senior regional directors filed into the massive boardroom. They carried heavily padded corporate folios and looked extremely confused by the tense atmosphere. Julian quickly abandoned his physical post at the door. He straightened his expensive silk tie and attempted to project his usual arrogant corporate authority. He loudly welcomed the management team and falsely announced that we were finalizing a minor internal restructuring audit. I did not allow his fabricated narrative to take root in the room. I connected my encrypted laptop to the central ceiling projector matrix. The massive digital monitor instantly illuminated the darkened boardroom. I displayed the comprehensive evidentiary dossier directly onto the screen. The first high-definition slide detailed Julian's fraudulent insurance claims. I highlighted the 12 heavy-duty freight liners he reported as destroyed. I projected the actual vehicle identification numbers alongside their current active GPS coordinates in Mexico. The senior director of fleet maintenance gasped audibly. I explained exactly how Julian pocketed the $1,850,000 insurance payout. He stole the trucks and kept the cash. Before I reveal the final offshore accounts to the room. Have you ever watched a manipulator lose control of their own lies in public? How quickly did their confident facade finally crack? Let me know your experience in the comments below. I advanced the presentation to the second detailed analytical slide. This section focused entirely on Elaine and her Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. I displayed the specific automated clearinghouse batch files proving her direct theft. The screen showed the exact routing numbers moving $2,400,000 offshore. The regional director of human resources stopped taking notes and stared in absolute shock. I clearly explained that Elaine had systematically drained the employee pension matching fund to cover her offshore transfers. She had literally stolen their retirement security to fund her private luxury lifestyle. Elaine tried to scream that the digital documents were completely fabricated by a bitter child. Her voice cracked in an uncharacteristic display of raw panic. The management team did not believe her hysterical denials. They knew my father would have never authorized these massive unregulated offshore shadow bank transactions. The cryptographic hash signatures verified the absolute authenticity of the internal banking ledgers. The regional directors began pulling out their corporate cell phones to call their personal attorneys. Julian stood completely frozen at the head of the mahogany table. I picked up the heavy manila envelope containing the drafted federal disclosures. I handed it directly to the senior director of corporate compliance. I instructed him to physically deliver it to the federal authorities to protect himself from criminal liability. The public utility of their carefully curated lies was permanently dismantled. Their fraudulent corporate empire was now actively burning to the ground in front of their own employees. The compliance director delivered the sealed envelope to the federal field office exactly 2 hours later. The systemic collapse of their fraudulent empire operated with absolute mathematical certainty. A senior forensic auditor at the regulatory agency flagged Julian's offshore transactions by Wednesday morning. They initiated an immediate hard asset freeze on all associated corporate bank accounts. This sudden regulatory action triggered a cascading default across his personal financial portfolio. His primary real estate lender panicked when the automated compliance software triggered a severe federal lien alert. The commercial bank foreclosed on his luxury penthouse apartment within 72 hours. He was legally evicted and his physical assets were seized to satisfy the outstanding margin calls. His luxury vehicles were towed directly from the underground parking garage. Elaine faced an equally devastating and rapid structural implosion. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service easily traced her Cayman Islands shell corporation. They discovered she had systematically failed to file foreign bank account reports for 7 consecutive years. The accumulated federal penalties for these specific violations totaled $3,840,000. The regional bank immediately locked her personal checking accounts to secure the pending federal tax liens. She attempted to sell her $85,000 diamond necklace to fund a criminal defense retainer. The estate jeweler immediately flagged the piece as stolen property originating from my father's contested estate. She was detained by local authorities in the jewelry showroom for attempted sale of stolen goods. I watched their frantic public downfall unfold through the automated National Court Registry feeds. Vanguard Logistics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection exactly 9 days after the boardroom presentation. I seamlessly executed the predetermined asset purchase agreement with the national freight conglomerate. They absorbed the core vehicle fleet and the active commercial routing contracts. The liquidated capital was transferred directly into my secure Apex Capital holding accounts. The final clearing wire equaled exactly $38,420,000. Julian and Elaine were permanently blacklisted from holding executive positions in any publicly traded entity. They lost their homes and their stolen wealth in less than 2 weeks. I optimized the failing corporate system by permanently excising the corrupted human variables. Their profound entitlement was no longer a liability to my operational efficiency. The master corporate registry was completely purged of their specific user profiles. The digital purge was flawlessly executed. I sat in my corner office at Apex Capital Holdings. The ambient noise of the Manhattan financial district was muffled by heavy insulated glass. My secure desktop terminal displayed the finalized acquisition closing documents. The total liquidated value of Vanguard Logistics was precisely distributed across our primary index funds in exactly 4 hours. Julian and Elaine were currently facing their preliminary federal arraignment hearings across town. I did not watch the local news coverage of their inevitable criminal indictment. It was an irrelevant data point. I was already analyzing the distressed debt profile of a failing biomedical manufacturer in Seattle. Corporate raiders are often depicted as deeply emotional or inherently malicious figures. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the core mathematics involved in asset liquidation. True financial restructuring is a completely emotionless mechanism designed to correct systemic inefficiencies. Julian and Elaine believed their bloodline granted them permanent immunity from basic accounting principles. They assumed betrayal was an abstract concept that could never be quantified into a rigid mathematical deficit. I simply audited their moral bankruptcy and aggressively balanced the final ledger. They learned the brutal reality of their actions. Do you believe that absolute financial ruin is the only true form of modern justice? Tell me your final thoughts in the comments below. I closed the Vanguard Logistics master acquisition file. I permanently archived the digital dossier on a secure offline server drive. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and watched the city lights begin to illuminate the skyline. The decade of quiet preparation was finally concluded. The stolen capital was successfully recovered and legally compounded. I felt a profound sense of absolute structural equilibrium. The complex equation of my past was finally solved. The cold silence was beautiful.